Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. And the 2038 offseason begins today. 2038 was a great season for the Buffalo Wings in terms of our regular season 105 and 57 record. You can see that we had the fifth best offense in baseball and the number one pitching staff in baseball last year, on our way to the best record in baseball. Unfortunately, our results in the playoffs were somewhat similar to what we saw from one of the top teams in baseball this season in real life. We were taken out by the San Diego Padres, who also had a very good pitching staff, 3-0 in the National League Division Series, and the Padres went on to win the National League pennant before they were dispatched by the Seattle Mariners in the World Series. So, all in all, it was a disappointing season. As good as the regular season was, felt like this is a team that we want to try to win a third championship with. And unfortunately, it didn't happen for us on the field this year. And before we begin our annual review of our top and bottom performers and start talking through our plans for this offseason, take one final look at how the team overall performed this year. As I mentioned, the record 105 and 57, right in line with our Pythagorean expectations. After a losing record in the month of April, we had a winning percentage of over 600 every month the rest of the way during the regular season. Ended up third in the National League in runs scored, although we were 10th in home runs. And we were number one in the National League and number one in baseball overall in terms of our runs allowed. You can see our pitching staff in the top handful of statistics in every category except for strikeouts, and we were still sixth there. Number one team in stolen bases and base running, and a team with very good defensive efficiency and an excellent zone rating as well. So was a real good team. Very disappointing that our record ended up being 0-3 in the playoffs, but it is what it is, and it's on to 2039. Taking a look at our pitching staff, as I mentioned, very strong this year, and we'll be returning most of these guys without a doubt, and hopefully close to all of them. Alexis Barajas will be back with us next year. He was 18-9 with a 3.63 ERA. He is our ace, and he is still signed for several years to come at a contract that the annual amounts are decreasing a bit over the next couple of years, which will help ease a small amount of the payroll pressure we anticipate being under. Sincere Shazier, guy who came up through our system, 17-7, 179 strikeouts, 3.38 ERA. Another good, well above average season from our number 2 starter. He will also be back next year. Our third starter is Alexis Mendoza, another guy who came up through our system after being a fourth-round pick in 2032, 13-10 with a 3.66 ERA this year. Not quite as impressive a season as he had as a rookie, but he's still going to be making the major league minimum next year, so certainly a guy we'll be very happy to have as our number 3 starter. Juan Estrada had the best ERA among our starting pitchers, did miss some time towards the end of the year with an injury, but he was back and healthy for the playoffs. Unfortunately for us, he was going to be our Game 4 starter, so he never got an opportunity to pitch after we were taken out 3-0. 10-5 record with a 3.18 ERA, 3.2 WAR as a pitcher. Estrada is also a two-way player for us, put up another 1.9 WAR as a hitter, batting .307 in 319 at-bats. Not a lot of home run pop with no homers, but he did have a almost ridiculous 34 doubles in those 319 at-bats. So he remains a pretty effective offensive player and a pretty good player for us overall. He's another guy who is signed for next year as well. We'll be getting into some more expensive team options after that, which we could use down the line to open up some payroll flexibility. But right now, feel pretty confident that we're going to have those top four guys back, and we'll feel good about our rotation with those four around. Isidro Ochoa, number 5 starter, 14-9 with a 4.45 ERA. Good, solid pitcher. He's been our number 5 guy for the past couple years. Expecting to be making close to $5 million next year in arbitration. While he's a good, solid pitcher, and I would love to have him back, given that the role we envision for him with the strength we have in this rotation with Barajas, Shazier, Mendoza, and Estrada is a number 5 starter. Paying $4.5 to $5 million for a number 5 starter seems like a luxury we probably cannot and should not afford with these Buffalo Wings. Given that he is a pretty good pitcher at a reasonable price point, though, the hope is that maybe we will be able to use him in the coming weeks as trade bait to perhaps add a bat with some home run power to help our offense. A big part of the reason why we're comfortable potentially moving on from Ochoa is that Eric Barbarito, who's the top prospect in our system, the number 36 prospect in baseball, had a excellent year at AAA Albany this year, was named the International League Pitcher of the Year. He did not do much when he came up, was 0-2 in 2 starts, 5 games pitched overall. But I look at that profile, and we look at the cost, and we look at the fact that he has nothing left to prove in the minors. And my thought is that we slide Barbarito into the 5 spot in our rotation next year. He'll cost us about $4 million a year less than Ochoa would. Still have an excellent pitching staff and an excellent rotation. And as I said, maybe Ochoa allows us to add some other talent to help our offense. Joe Scott, I know some of you didn't love the trade when picked him up last offseason, but I can't be disappointed with what he did for us. 6-4 record, 46 saves, 84 strikeouts, and 67 1/3 innings pitched, 160 ERA, ridiculous 257 ERA plus, and an excellent 68 FIP minus. Happy to have him back as our closer next year, and he's still making the major league minimum. Our stopper for the past 5 seasons has been Lorne Walborn. Had some injury issues this year, so he wasn't out there as often as we'd like him to be, although he was named an All-Star for the 3rd time in his career this year. His first 4 years with us, he led the league in games and holds every year while being a very high-volume arm out of the bullpen. I know some of you want me to lock him up right now, as I've tried to explain in the comments to some of your comments encouraging me to just sign him now. I'm not going to do that. We're going to let him hit free agency. Right now, we could probably sign him at 8.5-ish, maybe $9 million for 3 to 4 years, given what he's looking for. Dralix has opined to me that given that Walborn is only a 2-pitch pitcher, so he's clearly a reliever, and especially with his expectation that he's just going to be a bullpen guy rather than expecting a role as a closer. As I said, Dralix has kind of opined that he thinks the demand when he actually hits free agency could be less than what he's asking for right now. I think that's very possible, and am willing to risk perhaps having to pay him a little bit more to bring him back just to get that additional piece of information that I am thinking about very actively right now as to how a player like him would potentially be priced in free agency. So would love to have Walborn back, but not going to go crazy on the money given that he's going to be 33 years old next year. But certainly would leave a big hole in the bullpen with the high volume role he's played for us over the years if we lose him. Juan Veliz, left-hander, is a guy who is signed for next year at a pretty big number, but fortunately for us, we've got the Mets keeping almost half of that contract. Was not a real high volume guy for us this year, had an ERA below 1 in 27 2/3 innings pitched. Happy to have him back as a lefty in the bullpen next year. Johanne Varejo is an interesting decision. He's been a pretty valuable reliever for us for several years, guy who came up through our system. His arbitration number is going to be around $4 million next year, which is getting expensive for a setup guy, especially with the fact that Elvin Jimenez, we just signed to a very cost-effective team option. He's older than Varejo, but also a guy who has a very good profile and has been a very effective pitcher for us. Led the National League in saves this year holds this year, with Walborn being on the bench for a long time with that injury. So Scott, Veliz, and Jimenez all will be back with us next year as three of our top guys out of the pen. Walborn and Varejo, TBD. Moving on to some of the other relievers, Mike Waters is a guy who's come up through our system. He will be making, I believe, the major league minimum still next year. So happy to have him as a right-handed arm if we do end up deciding that we're not going to pay up for both Ochoa and Varejo and perhaps try to trade them away to extract some value and some bats out of them. Waters, I think, would be a guy who could step into a setup role for us. Cameron Johnson, a guy we picked up for a second time at the trade deadline, second time in the past 3 years that we picked him up at the trade deadline, was a reasonably productive arm for us out of the bullpen with 42 strikeouts in 28 and a third innings. But he's a guy who's likely looking for a starting role. So going to be looking for, he's not even willing to talk with us. So Cameron Johnson will likely be moving on from. A few other guys, Inahiro Miyake is a guy we picked up in a trade with Colorado. He is going to be eligible for arbitration, I believe, this year. Let me just check for sure exactly what his contract situation is going to be. 2.7. Okay, so he's still on. He hasn't hit arbitration yet, so he's still kind of on the original amount. But it's a 1-year renewal contract. So since he was signed as a experienced player out of Japan, so he's going to be right at that $2.68 million again next year. He had a reasonably productive year for us. A 1.88 ERA and 62 and a third innings pitched is clearly very productive. He didn't end up making the playoff roster because we had such an embarrassment of riches in terms of our left-handers in the pen with Walborn, Veliz, and Johnson ahead of him. But with the fact that we will be moving on from Johnson and possibly could be moving on from Walborn, Miyake's probably back with us next year. Left-hander David Espinoza, who is a guy who's come up through our system, a third-round pick in 2032, split this year between AAA Albany and the majors in Buffalo, likely a left-handed arm out of the pen. And if something went wrong with one of our starting pitchers, Espinoza right now would probably be the guy most likely to move into the rotation. And another lefty to talk about, Ben Borjan, sixth-round pick in 2035 out of Arizona. Looks like a back-of-the-rotation starter or a lefty arm out of the bullpen. Split this year between Utica and Albany, was pretty effective at both levels with ERA pluses and FIP minuses well above average. And he was also pretty productive in 3 innings pitched in the majors, earning a save, striking out 4, and not allowing a hit. So feel like the bullpen, even if we do end up moving on from Johnson and perhaps trading away Varejo and Ochoa, is still pretty high quality and pretty deep, with the fact that we have young guys like Barbarito, Espinoza, and Borjan all positioned to take on more prominent roles in our bullpen next year. Big decisions will be Ochoa and Varejo. Do we want to move on from them rather than pay them in arbitration, and what can we get in return? And then what ultimately happens with Lorne Walborn when he does hit free agency. So when all is said and done with the pitchers, feel pretty confident even if we don't go crazy in free agency and don't go crazy in the trade market and let some players go. We're going to be heading into 2039 with a pitching staff that we feel pretty good about, which is why, as I mentioned, if we do end up moving on from the likes of Ochoa and Vallejo, may try to extract an everyday player for one or both of those guys in a trade, because I feel like our offense is where we could have perhaps a bit more turnover. Mitch Houlihan, we picked up in a trade deadline trade with Pittsburgh. Real happy to have him on board. He's going to be making the major league minimum again next year. Really like him as a backup catcher. He's good defensively, and he has hit over 300 every year that he's been in the majors. I've talked about this before. This batting profile doesn't scream 300 hitter to me, but I have to acknowledge that at this point he's had 459 major league at-bats, and he's a 318 hitter, so he's doing something right. And if he hits anywhere close to that with that good defensive ability, he is certainly in the mix to be our backup catcher next year. Likely behind Andres Medina, who did end up bouncing back with a better second half of his season. Love his durability, love his personality and influence in the clubhouse, love his excellent defense. First half of the year, he was a pretty average offensive player, but he finished the year with a 112 WRC plus, which is right where he was a year ago. 13 homers and 51 ribbies, down a bit from his production in 2037. But still a guy who goes out and basically plays 75 to 80% of the games for us at a very high level. He does have a deal with a no-trade clause that he's not willing to waive right now. We did front-load his contract a bit, so he'll be making 18 each of the next 2 years. If he does end up on our team and never willing to perhaps waive that no-trade before he can opt out. But given that we do have some talent in the minors at catcher, and we also have Houlihan on board who we really like, feel like if we're able to move on from Medina at some point, certainly something to consider. But again, if we end up with a premier defensive catcher who's incredible in the clubhouse, who's an above average offensive player, that's an asset that we certainly don't mind playing behind the plate 120, 125, 130 games a season. Turning to our infielders, Joe Gallagher ended up putting up a pretty good sophomore season, 37 homers and 109 ribbies as a rookie last year. Fewer home runs, 4 fewer to be specific, with 33, but 1 more ribby on the year. Ended up being an above-average offensive player for the second straight year. His WAR was materially better than a year ago, although he doesn't bring much to the table defensively. Played every game for us as a DH. Certainly a guy we're very comfortable having on the team while he's making the major league minimum, which he will be again next year. At some point, given his personality quirks and his lack of defensive ability, as he starts getting more expensive, he's certainly a guy that we might look to move on from. But right now, for a team that doesn't have a ton of power hitters, getting rid of the guy who's led our team in homers and ribbies 2 consecutive seasons and is making the major league minimum is clearly not a path that we would consider going down. Mike Heiner, first-round pick from 6 years ago at this point out of Bradley, has become a pretty solid player for us. Another kind of typical Heiner season this year, 287 average, 17 homers, 94 ribbies. He plays first base, he plays left field and right field for us. WAR of 2.5, above average offensively. Not a big-time player for us, but he is a guy who is still not making crazy money, so would expect him to be back on the team next year as a important left-handed hitter in our lineup. Not even going to really talk about Jackson Holliday. We ended up calling him up at the end, 34, soon to be 35-year-old. Had 1 at-bat with us this year. It was just organizational depth that we had in AAA. Deshaun Seifu once again led the National League in steals, but it was admittedly one of the worst years of his career. And again, the guy led the league in runs for the fifth time in his career, led the league in stolen bases for an 11th consecutive season, incredibly efficient base stealer as usual. But the batting average dipped to 271 after 5 straight years above 300. And his OPS of 719 or 716 was his lowest since he was 25 years old in 2030. So he was, when all was said and done, was a pretty average offensive player. Still put up a 4.7 WAR, played second and third for us this year, and as we've talked about, still very productive on the base paths. He is heading into his last guaranteed year with us at $25 million, following which we'll have a team option. Will be interesting to see how he does next year. His speed is holding up incredibly well for a guy who's in his approaching his mid-30s, specifically the actual mid-30 when he gets to 35 years old. Still a good bunter and still pretty good contact and gap power. Not going to strike out a lot. High work ethic and intelligence. Iron Man who's going to be out there every day for us. He's never really had a serious injury in his career. So really happy to have him back, but will be interesting to see what he looks like as he continues to age. We've talked about many times in the past, we'd love to have the guy who was our number 1 overall pick back in 2026, the second version of the Fordham Flash behind Frankie Frisch, a good century beforehand. Would love to have him on our team throughout his career. 145 triples, I believe he's kind of closing in. I think he's very close with that number to Willie Wilson for the most triples of anyone who's been playing that I actually saw play. Roberto Clemente, who has a few more than Wilson, will be the next kind of notable target on the list for me when he gets by Wilson in terms of triples. I was at least alive briefly at the same time as Roberto Clemente. And then Stan Musial has the most triples of anyone who was actually kind of alive, period, while I was alive, although he certainly wasn't playing then. Clemente was still playing when I was alive. So see how long it takes him to get by those 3 guys in triples. He's led the league in triples 6 times in his career. Certainly has a chance at having more triples than basically anyone who's played over the past century when all is said and done. He's going to likely pass Lou Brock for second all-time in steals, likely in April next year, assuming he stays healthy. And then it's just getting to 1,000 and then seeing how close he can get to Rickey Henderson's all-time record. And with 2,226 hits, still a chance if he plays another 5 or 6 seasons of getting to 3,000 hits, assuming his skills don't completely fall off. So he's put up a 66.6 WAR over the course of his career at this point. And as I mentioned, chasing down some legendary players in terms of his career triples, chasing down a couple of Hall of Famers in terms of his career steals, and chasing down the 3,000 hit club are going to be things that we'll hopefully be following with Seifu over the next several seasons of this playthrough. And pulling up the always useful baseball reference, looks like Willie Wilson was 147 career triples, tied for 56th all-time with Bobby Veach. So only 2 triples away from the most triples of anyone that I've ever actually seen play. As I mentioned, of guys who were playing like while I was alive, Roberto Clemente is 27th overall with 166. So that's a number that conceivably Seifu could hit late 2040, early 2041. And then Stan Musial is the only player really outside of the dead ball era who's in the top 20 overall, tied for 19th overall with 177 triples with Rabbit Moranville. So 32 away from potentially tying Musial and moving into the top 20 all-time in career triples. The all-time mark of 309 by Sam Crawford, certainly not realistic. But there's only 8 players with over 200 triples in career history at this point. And as I mentioned, the most recent guys on that list are guys like Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb in terms of when they were playing. So if Seifu was able to ultimately enter the 200 triple club, he'd be the first player to do that in over a century. Moving on to the rest of our infielders, who we won't spend nearly as much time talking about as we did with Seifu. Tegan Tiley, former number 1 first-round pick in 2031, 23rd overall, made his major league debut the second half of this year, hit .272 with 5 homers and 26 ribbies in 173 at-bats. I don't love that he's fragile, but he expects to be a bench player. I think he'll be a bench player for us. Actually, he was up all year. He wasn't playing every day for us, but he didn't really have much left to prove in AAA. So we had him on the team this entire season. Think he will likely be a platoon guy for us again next year. Likely will be starting against left-handed pitching, and with his defensive versatility and his decent bat, will likely be a useful utility infielder for us. Jim Arp ended up struggling mightily for us this year, hitting just a .186 in 231 at-bats. Certainly disappointing to see how he produced away from Colorado. Certainly knew that Colorado was going to influence his productivity, but he was a well above average offensive player in Colorado, well below average with us this year. Like his defensive versatility, similar to Tiley, and I do like the fact that he does have some pop in his bat with 11 home runs in those 231 at-bats, but certainly going to need him to be hitting at least 25, 30, hopefully 40 points better than that .186 to be a guy worthwhile of earning some playing time with us next year. Joe Edwards ended up having a nice bounce-back season, even though he was not a regular guy in our starting lineup for the first half of the year. Did still end up playing in 132 games, 20 homers in 379 at-bats, also walked 81 times, has a great eye. So his WRC plus was 133 on the year, put up a 3 WAR, versatile guy who can play a lot of infield positions for us. Starting to get expensive, going to be making about $10.5 million next year in arbitration. But with those 20 home runs, he was still second on our team in homers, even in the limited playing time. So given our offensive challenges, probably going to be bringing Edwards back for what could be his final run with us before he hits free agency. Steve Anderson, another guy who's headed to arbitration, number getting a bit expensive, probably can get him signed for a little over $7.5 million. Was an above-average offensive player this year, pretty respectable defensive player, 262 average, 18 homers, put up a 3.1 WAR, which was the best number of his career. If there's a way for me to bring him back, I would like to, because he is one of our better defensive infielders, and he's also got a representative major league bat. I don't know, with the money that he'll be making down the line, how many more years we're going to continue to have him around. But given that we're potentially looking to trade a few pitchers who are going to be making some money, if there's a way for us to bring Edwards and Anderson back, probably from an offensive perspective, it's a choice we should make, because I kind of like our infield in the offense that they will potentially generate with guys like Gallagher, Heiner, although he's more a outfielder, and Gallagher, to be fair, although he's more of a DH. Those guys can play first. We've got Seifu, Edwards, and Anderson who could be starting. Tegan Tiley in the mix as a potential utility guy. And then Tim Hull is a potential utility guy or platoon infielder as well. Hit 249, only 3 homers this year, but did have 19 doubles and 4 triples and 245 at-bats. A little bit below average offensively, but another guy who's pretty versatile defensively. Feel like we can probably generate the offense we need, bringing back most of those infielders next year, which leads me to think that if we're going to try to extract some trade value from the likes of Ochoa and Vallejo, looking for an outfielder who can hit a bit, may be the path for us to follow. Moving on to our outfielders, Frank Carranza came up late in the season again after a full year in Albany this year. Doesn't really have much to left to prove in AAA at 24 years old. The former 7th-round draft pick, probably in the mix to be a utility outfielder for us and a good pinch hitter off the bench. Ben Elmquist could be taken over as our center fielder next year. Hit reasonably well for us, 282 average, 22 doubles and 10 homers in 280 at-bats. Was up with the team the entire year. Was not an everyday starter, but that 115 WRC plus, playing primarily against left-handed pitching, was pretty solid. Not a perfect defensive center fielder, but I think he's someone who could end up competing for our role as a starting center fielder next year, because the 2 primary guys who have played center field for us this year could both be gone. Max Clark, we made the big trade for him before the trade deadline, and he was incredibly effective for us. 143 WRC plus, 7 homers and 35 ribbies and 193 at-bats, and did have that clutch 2-run homer in the bottom of the 9th of Game 1 of the playoffs to tie things up for us, even though we did end up going on to lose that game in the 11th inning. But he's just looking for way too much money, $27 million a year for 6 years, for a guy who's in his mid-30s and is wrecked physically. Just not a contract that we're willing to offer. So he will certainly be gone. And then I mentioned Elmquist as a potential center fielder because Tim Gaglia, as much as I like him defensively in center field, is a guy who's going to be making over $5 million next year. And he has pretty clearly proven over the course of his major league career that he's a pretty average offensive player. Now, an average offensive player with the really good range that he has in center field is still valuable. Put up a 3 WAR a year ago and a 2.6 WAR this year. But if we perhaps pivot Elmquist into center field and open up some salary, trading away Gaglia, maybe an opportunity for us to upgrade in left or right field. As I mentioned, I think Carranza in a best case scenario is a 4th or 5th outfielder rather than a starter. And Mike Broughton, based on the year that he had with us, probably have to put him in the same mix. He was a below average offensive player, 260 average with only 10 homers and 481 at-bats. He was very clutch, driving in 86 runs during that playing time, but certainly was disappointing in terms of his offensive production. Broughton, though, is another guy with that 65 range, could be in the mix in center field. Again, I don't think that Broughton or Elmquist are as good defensively as either Clark or Gaglia. Clark is gone. Question is, do we want to pay about $5 million for Gaglia next year, or do we potentially use Gaglia in conjunction with some of the pitchers that we might look to trade away to try to bring on a big bat for a corner outfield spot to really give us a little more of a home run threat? So depending on how much money we're able to clear by trading away pitchers, perhaps we move on from Gaglia as well. But we're going to start exploring what the options are to add a big-time bat in the outfield, because as I talked about, I kind of like our infield bats, really like our catcher bats. To me, outfield is the area where we need somebody with 60, 65 home run power who could hit the ball out of the ballpark for us. And before we finish up the episode, I'm going to take a relatively quick look at some of the top prospects in our system after bringing up a lot of players to the majors over the last couple of years. We've got a middling farm system ranked 19th out of 32. We've already talked about Barbarito, who probably ends up as our number 5 starter next year. 3 other top 100 prospects on our team. Guadalupe Amezcua, a scouting discovery. So we do continue to invest some money in scouting to hopefully ensure that we get more discoveries like him over time. Viewed as the number 44 prospect in baseball, we finally promoted him to single A this year, even though he had never done much of anything in rookie ball and hit just a $170 in single A with Marathon. Still think he could be a interesting utility infielder for us down the line. Just a matter of how much that bat develops. Still has a lot of work to do in terms of developing the bat at this point, and he is already 22 years old. I know Three Quarters Badger in particular has been encouraging us to move on from Amezcua. Certainly would be something we would consider if we could extract some value from him, given that he's the 44th ranked prospect in baseball. Maybe that's something for us to pursue. Luis Nava is a guy that we were pretty happy to get back when we traded Bobby Bolig last offseason to dump some contract. Split this year between rookie ball, A ball, and high A ball. Viewed as the number 85 prospect in baseball, so he's kind of ramped up his development since he came into our system. Certainly with that outfield range and error rating, could be a center fielder of the future for us. Just hope that that bat continues to develop. And then our final top 100 prospect is Jim Lance, second round pick back in 2036, split this year between rookie ball and A ball. Was not particularly effective at either level, but if he develops to his full potential, could certainly still be a pretty interesting pitcher for us. Probably not an ace, but if he fully develops, he could be a real nice 3-starter. Devin Cabuto, a first-round pick in 2035, as we've been pushing on pitchers. Split this year between high A ball and double A ball right at the end of the year. 11-5 with a 4.07 ERA in high A ball. Just pitched a third of an inning in double A. 22 years old now. Another guy who looks like he could be a useful major leaguer if he continues to develop. Juan Palomo was a big international free agent signing for us this past year. He's only 17 years old, still at our international complex. Alfredo Negrete, another guy who was a scouting discovery, who's a top 200 prospect. Played an A-ball for us this year, had some injury issues, unfortunately, so he didn't have a full season for us. Was reasonably competent in the time that he did play, though, with 6 homers and 21 ribbies and 53 at-bats. So looking forward to hopefully getting a full season out of Negrete next year. Several other top 200 prospects, 4 left. Eric Fisher, 18-year-old, who was our second-round pick this past year, 2-2 with a 7.47 ERA and rookie ball as an 18-year-old. Think he's got potential to be a decent pitcher if he fully develops. Who knows whether he actually will. Jorge Berrios is a guy who will likely be competing for a spot on our team next year. We talked about how we like our catcher position with Medina as our starter, but if Medina is ever willing to move on in a trade, Berrios is certainly closing in on being ready for the majors. He's an incredibly unique profile. His eye is legendary, although he's not really that good a contact hitter. You look at his minor league career, and it's ridiculous. 201 career batting average, but a 405 career on-base percentage because his eye is just so exceptional. And he's also a slightly above average defensive player. So we had him down in AAA this whole year to get him a full year of seasoning. And in terms of his development, he's going to be turning 24 years old soon. Is in a situation where he still has one option year left. So hopefully he'll be in the mix at some point to help us in the not so distant future. Josh Nagy, first round pick in 2036. Spent most of the year in rookie ball, and then given that he's 20 years old, we promoted him up to A ball. Was not good at either level. Another pitcher who hopefully with continued investment in our farm system, good coaching, and a good personality will develop into something useful over the next few years. And Chris Lott, first round pick in 2037. Another guy who hasn't been particularly effective in terms of his stats. 2-7 record with a 6.55 ERA, walking an insane amount of batters and giving up an insane amount of home runs in rookie ball. Just turned 20 years old. Don't know whether he'll start next year in rookie ball or A ball, but would certainly think that at some point during the year we'll be taking him up to A ball just to see what he can do there. So although it's a middling farm system, don't know that there's any real superstar prospects, but do feel that with the likes of Barbarito, Lance, Cabuto, Fisher, Nagy, and Lott, we've got some guys who could be helping our team over the years. Looking at some of the other more advanced prospects, Steve Duncan was a fourth-round pick in 2036. Unfortunately, he suffered a torn labrum this year, so he's going to be out all of next year most likely. Did hit .317 with 10 homers and 183 at-bats for Double-A Utica. Looks like he's a guy who could be a useful corner outfielder or utility outfielder down the line for us, but not going to happen next year. Hopefully he'll be able to play in AAA in 2040. He's one of the few guys who's relatively close. Jesus Rivera is another one, international free agent signing from 2033. Split the year between High A Jamestown, where he hit just .248 but did have 12 homers. Given that he's 23 years old, we promoted him to Double-A Utica, where he hit .283. Was an above-average offensive player. Another guy who looks like he could be pretty solid defensively. The question is his bat, so kind of fits a similar mold to some of the outfielders we've had in the majors recent years in terms of Tyreek Hardage and Tim Gaglia, and more recently Ben Elmquist, guys who are pretty decent defensively. The question is how much they're going to hit, but Rivera is a guy who could be in the mix for a call-up towards the end of next season. So not a brilliant minor league system, but it is an area where we have invested a lot in recent years in terms of our scouting and development budgets, and we've got some guys who can help us along the way over the next few years, we think, in the system. Just don't feel like there's any real superstar prospects, unfortunately, particularly in terms of position players right now. And with that review complete, we're going to finish up the episode. In our next episode, we'll take our annual look at some of the top prospects in baseball and find out how some of our former players are faring around the majors with their new teams. And then it's going to be time after that to dig right into this offseason. If you've got thoughts on what we should or shouldn't consider doing in the trade market and with our arbitration-eligible players, always helpful to hear those in the comments. And look forward to seeing if we can make the moves this offseason that will ultimately ensure we're a more successful team in the playoffs than we were this past year. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.